I will get started and introduce all of you. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today, this afternoon, for our second in our series this semester, for our TREC seminar series. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Christa to TREC. She's an assistant professor of regional economics and food and resource economics department at UF. She is also the director of the Economic Impact Analysis Program, which conducts regional economic analysis on a wide range of activities and industries, including agriculture, forestry, fisheries, education, and healthcare. She leads the UF IFAS efforts related to disaster impact analysis for agriculture, natural resource, and food industries, including efforts related to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, tropical cyclones. So you'll probably hear a lot about her research, and if whenever, hopefully not, have any of these issues with hurricanes, harmful algae blooms, and the COVID pandemic, which she'll be discussing today. She graduated with a PhD in economics from West Virginia University in 2012 and holds affiliate faculty status with the Florida Sea Grant, UF School of Natural Resources and Environment, the UF Water Institute, the Regional Research Institute of West Virginia, and the University of Westford in Iceland. So thank you very much, Christa, for joining us. And we're looking very forward to your presentation and learning more about how COVID has affected us in Florida.
Thank you, Trent, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for coming today. I feel like this is a talk that I have given several times since the pandemic started, but you guys are getting the hot off the presses county level results today. So there are people that have been waiting a long time, and you're going to be the first ones to see them. Trent covered a little bit about, I'll talk about our program, our disaster impact analysis work generally, and then jump into everything that we've been doing on the COVID-19 pandemic. But I'm absolutely interested in talking about the other things at the end when we have a little bit of time for Q&A. And this is also one of those topics that I can get going and talk on for a lot longer than 40 minutes, but I'll try to keep myself to 40 minutes so that we've got plenty of time for that afterwards. All right, so try and give you an overview there. So I run the economic impact analysis program, and I like to refer to it as both a research and extension program here within UF IFAS, and we're housed within the Food and Resource Economics Department. We're a small but mighty group of 8 individuals from administrative staff, postdocs, graduate research assistants, and we have several affiliated faculty and affiliated students that are not listed here as well. Our expertise is actually in regional economic modeling, economic impact analysis, things like economic contribution studies that you might see come out of our group, and disaster impact analysis. And we'd like to be able to apply those to different sectors, different industries, different items that might come up within a local government. So I like to refer to myself as an expert at becoming an expert on something so that we can assess the regional economic impacts of it. We provide technical assistance on economic modeling to industry groups, other academic units, government agencies, and local communities. And then we do conduct sponsored research projects that involve detailed analyses of a particular industry, a particular region, or a particular situation. Just in case everybody is not already familiar, because I wasn't quite sure who the audience would be here, I'll give you a little bit of background on production agriculture in Florida, because that's most of what we're going to cover disaster impacts on today. So production agriculture in Florida is literally the A to Z of commodity production in the US. It's estimated that we produce between 200 and 300 different commodities. That's from animals and livestock to different various crops. You guys specialize in the tropical fruits and vegetables, and some form of agriculture is present in every single county within the state, and that's not often the case. There's 47,000 plus farms operating on 9.7 million acres, and they're producing nearly $10 billion worth of crop, livestock, and forest products annually. And that directly supports nearly 138,000 full-time and part-time jobs in the state. So it's a significant sector, and it's often overlooked when we start to do things like disaster impact analysis. A little bit of background on disaster. So when I typically am talking about our disaster impact analysis program, we're looking at things like tropical cyclones, wildfires, severe weather events, floods, droughts, and even freezes. And there's a database kept by NOAA that shows that since 1980, the United States has experienced 285 what they term billion-dollar natural disasters, resulting in a total cost of $1.88 trillion. So these are events that a single event has resulted in $1 billion or more in losses. Florida alone experiences about $5 to $10 billion in economic losses annually resulting from natural disasters. So this, I'm not speaking to just agriculture right here, but this is economic losses generally. And again, that's only from these events that result in $1 billion or more each year. Events that we have assessed in our program began in 2016 after Hurricane Irma, when I arrived in 2016, and prior to that, there was a 10-year drought of landfall tropical cyclone events in the state of Florida. And Hurricane Irma was quite a big event coming up the entire peninsula. It was a large record-setting storm in and of itself, and the department sort of felt like we should be doing something. So we started to put together baseline data, gathering information from extension faculty, from research and education centers on what happened. And over the time since then, we've sort of harmonized this assessment process and are at the point where we are ready to go when an event happens. So events that we have assessed are Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael, and just this past year, Hurricane Sally and Tropical Storm Eta. Events that we prepped for and luckily didn't have to do a full assessment because there hasn't been extensive enough damage that administration felt like we should release the tools, were Hurricane Dorian and various freeze events over the last few winters. So there are several efforts, though, that we've been going through that I wanted to talk today about assessing the impact of COVID-19. So this is a completely different type of disaster, but when you're known for having a program in disaster impact analysis and a global pandemic happens, everybody turns to you and says, you'll know what to do. Let's begin assessing this particular event. So the three things that I'll talk about today are a survey that we implemented from March to mid-May, where in the past I've been sharing results on a statewide assessment. I'll share some information on regional assessments today and then talk about some work that we're beginning on commodity-specific assessments. We'll also have a funded project with the USDA now looking, it's called Lessons from COVID-19, and I'll talk about the broader objectives of that project, but we have some preliminary survey results from that. And then there's an effort between UF-IFAS, Florida Gulf Coast University, and Florida A&M University to collect the qualitative information behind some of these quantitative results that we have. So we call it the stories and experiences behind the data. So if we start with the survey that we implemented back in, really when things began to shut down in 2020, March to mid-May, we needed to transition to assess COVID-19, which was a very different situation than something like a tropical cyclone. Food service industry demand, typically 54% of food money is spent away from home. So in places like restaurants, or you're getting a meal at a hotel or a theme park. And those places were shut down in an effort to lower the curve or flatten the curve and make sure that we weren't spreading the pandemic nearly as much as we could be if we were fully open. The effect of the social distancing and stay-at-home orders was that demand plummeted in places like theme parks, restaurants, hotels, schools, a lot of these institutional or hospitality and food service industries. And the fact for Florida is that a large portion of our production goes into these industries. So the example that we have heard quite a bit throughout the pandemic is that tomatoes are 80 to 85% of Florida's tomatoes goes into hospitality and food service industry. So when those things shut down, that was a big hit and a big change for a lot of these growers that happened almost overnight. So it was a major disruption to our food system. And I think a lot often you hear that the food system was the food supply chain was broken, but I think it's just it's disruption, and we need to know what happened. How did people adjust, and how can we do better and be more resilient in the future? So we put together a COVID-19 assessment tool. What we did is take the tool that we're used to using in the event of a natural disaster and sort of retool it to be more appropriate to this demand side shock as opposed to a supply side shock. Responses were collected from April 16th to May 15th, and we analyzed them and have been sharing them since about the end of April. What were we collecting? Background information on operations, revenues, employment, market channels. If people would like detailed analyses of what happened to a specific sector at a specific time, we need to know the baseline. And sometimes we have aggregate baseline data, but we don't have very detailed baseline data. So we like to try to collect some of that at the same time. The current status at the time, whether the business was open or closed, had they been changing their business operations if they were open, or what were the reasons for closure if they did decide to close. And then just asking questions specifically about the impact of the pandemic itself. How were revenues changing? What was the employment situation? The customer base, how was that changing? And whether or not they were changing their products or services offered. And then we did collect their willingness to participate in potential follow-up or similar surveys for related businesses in the future, because we knew this was probably going to be the first of many efforts and probably decades of research to assess the impact of the pandemic. In that initial survey, our overall participation was quite high. So we had 729 responses, and you can see that we got at least a few responses from every county in the state, some much more than others. And that was a factor of what was going on in a particular county at the time. So Florida never had a state level shutdown or mask mandates, things like that, but also different sectors or different commodities were being impacted differently depending on the seasonality as well. When we looked at the results for particular commodity groups, we saw that there was a lot of variation within each commodity group, and across the commodity groups. So this is showing our the navy blue bars here are showing the full range of responses, the minimum to maximum of operations that reported a 100% loss. They were completely shut down or weren't having any sales at all, to some that were actually reporting a positive impact of the pandemic. Some, even in terms of the livestock and aquaculture sector here, some were reporting 98% increase in sales revenue in this particular period as compared to their average sales revenue in the past. The orange bars are showing you the average for all of the responses in a particular commodity group, though, and you can see that all of those were negative. So even though each commodity group had some operations doing worse, some operations doing better, all of them on average were a negative impact. So what we are able to do with this information is look at take our information on the baseline for these commodity groups. What are their total annual sales over the last 5 years? Prices change, production changes. There have been hurricanes in some of these years, so we like to look at a 5-year average and then determine what the percentage of their annual revenue that they would typically expect to make in this March to mid-May period. So this was not a part of the survey, but was determined by talking with experts in the field, talking with some extension agents to determine, what's that typical revenue made in that period, to determine the output at risk. So at that time in the state of Florida, we determined there's about $2.5 billion of sales revenues that would be expected to take place for production agriculture in that March to mid-May interval, and then took the percentage losses from the survey with a 90% confidence interval to estimate that $894 million of losses directly due to COVID-19 across these commodity groups listed. So that's good information. This information typically goes straight to the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Sometimes if they are lobbying for federal aid, it goes up to Washington, DC, and we were able to produce that pretty quickly. Something that has taken longer for us to decide how to do and whether or not we're confident in the results is, to look at the geographic variation in these production losses. What we were finally able to do is allocate losses to counties based on commodity group level production averages over the last 5 years. So again, we're looking at county level production in those particular commodity groups averaged across the 5 years. And then at this point, using state level averages for that revenue proportion that happens in the March to mid-May period and the averages for the revenue losses. So if you think back to the map that I showed on the response rates, there are a few counties where we will be able to go in. We have enough responses to estimate a more accurate county level number, but many of them had 1 to 10 responses, and that's not enough for us to be confident in a county level number. So that's why we're using those state level averages here at first. And these values are expressed in 2020 dollars, which I think is different than the ones that I showed before. So if some of the sums don't quite sum up, that's the reason for those small differences. But you can see that, different counties experienced different things here. So these top counties are experiencing $100 to $150 million of losses, and some of them are obvious. Palm Beach County, Miami-Dade County, Hillsborough and Orange. You'll see that these are popping up as large nursery and greenhouse operations in particular, as well as the fruit and vegetables that were in season at the time. So if we separate it out by commodity group, again, you can see that geographic variation in what was happening. The darker counties are experiencing more losses in a particular commodity group, and the lighter not as much. And I'll remind you that this was only the March to mid-May period. So a lot of the things like field and row crops that are grown up in the Panhandle were not even in season yet. I'll make one more note here that when Palm Beach County and some of these other counties in South Florida show up in field and row crops, we do have sugar cane allocated into that category at this point. But the point is just that there's wide geographic variation. So when you say the state was impacted as such, that doesn't mean the entire state was impacted in the same way. Just one other way to look at it. So the size of these pie charts is representing the overall total production loss due to COVID-19. And then the different colors are showing you the different commodity groups that were driving those losses in that particular county. So you can see that the nursery and greenhouse crops, a lot of those are high value crops, high value per acre, and are driving a significant portion of the losses here. But you do see things like animal production, fruit and tree nuts, and the vegetables and melons pop up as well. Stepping back, from the commodity group, I mentioned we got 700 responses to that particular survey. That doesn't mean that we got a very representative sample of every crop, all of those 200 to 300 different crops that are grown in Florida. So, but of the specific commodities within a commodity group that we were allowed to assess based on that response rate, we saw a very similar thing, that even within a commodity group, there was a wide variation in experiences across different types of commodities. So the best example here is to look on the far right, the livestock and aquaculture category. Beef cattle had some operations that lost everything, but some operations that were doing better, upwards of 86% increase in sales revenue for this period. And on average, we're down 36%. But we have aquaculture in this category as well. So the clams and oysters, many of them were all reported negative impacts. So there were no positive or increase in sales revenue. Part of this is because more seafood is purchased away from home. There's not as many people that will purchase and cook seafood at home as something like beef or chicken. but on average, their losses were 75%. So they were hit particularly hard and very differently than other commodities within their particular category. So what we are able to do with this information is when we had enough responses and when we had good baseline data on a particular commodity, we can produce commodity specific reports. So we did have data that we obtained from FDAC's Division of Aquaculture on shellfish production data for the last several years. And we were able to use that in conjunction with the information from our survey to estimate losses specific to shellfish aquaculture from the pandemic. So we estimated somewhere between $1.5 and $2.2 million of losses for that particular category. And we're starting to move into a few other commodities to see if this is possible there as well. Moving on to the second part of this. So a lot of that information we were able to leverage as preliminary assessments for grant proposals that we were going after. And one of those that has come in is a grant from the USDA for a proposal that was titled Lessons from COVID-19, Positioning Regional Food Supply Chains for Future Pandemics, Natural Disasters, and Human-Made Crises. The project team that we have for this, we have several colleagues within IFAS at the PI Center, the Center for Public Issues Education, also colleagues at University of California, Irvine, Kansas State University, University of Minnesota, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There's 4 overall objectives of this particular project. First, just to assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on farm and food supply chain operations. So very similar to the effort that I just described here in Florida in the early stages of the pandemic, but broadening to other geographies and a broader take on the food supply chain instead of just focused on production. Second, to understand capacities and structural vulnerabilities of regional food systems to support their population needs. So one of the things that some operations were able to do is switch to a more regional or more local market, and assessing whether or not the availability of that or the vulnerability of such a market, if you were already supplying that, helped or hindered during the pandemic. Third, to develop resources and strategies for current and future disruptions. So anything that we can learn as a lesson from COVID-19 on how to make the food system more resilient in the future is what we're looking for there. And then develop and offer training programs to strengthen support and understanding for local and regional supply chain participants at times of disruption. So if, we have been accused in our survey of being biased against, wanting to move to everything to local and regional supply chain. And that's absolutely not the point of the project. So, but, if we determine that a local and regional supply chain is something that helped during a disaster event, the question is, how can we make that known and support it in the future during these events? It does not mean that, everyone will start serving only a local area for the entirety of time. So that first component is what we've been able to complete so far. It's a COVID-19 food supply chain survey. Again, we're asking very similar things to what we did in our previous survey. How has your food or farming business been affected by the pandemic, these public health measures, or the economic crisis that has resulted? We would like to collect enough information to examine differences in impacts, again, across sectors and commodities, across the regions. So our 3 focus regions are Florida, California, and then the Minnesota, Wisconsin area in the upper Midwest. And looking across business scale and scope or different business characteristics. So technically the survey period has closed, but we actually got too few responses in the state of Florida to be included in these preliminary analyses. So I have it open still. I mentioned we received over 700 responses initially, but either survey fatigue, pandemic fatigue, something is going on, because we went through all of our normal routes and only have about 80 responses from the state of Florida, even though we sent out thousands of emails and went through our normal chains for distributing through associations. The survey links were open from February 1st to April 15th. As I mentioned, Florida is still open if we get some stragglers. There were regional efforts. So we had a Florida survey, a California survey, and a Minnesota, Wisconsin survey that were distributed separately. We made requests to organizations to distribute the survey links, and they did here in Florida and in the other regions. And we also purchased business contacts from a company called Data Axle, which gave us the direct email, allowed us to do some targeted postcard mailing and follow-up phone calls in some cases. So I did directly email 9,000 food supply chain operations in the state of Florida and still only received about 80 responses. So the sample, again, I'm going to walk through preliminary results only for California and Minnesota, Wisconsin at this point, but the samples as of April 13th, we had about 435 responses in California, 349 in Minnesota, Wisconsin. Those went down a little bit when we determined, whether or not they were usable. Some people click on the survey and then don't answer any of the questions. And then whether or not they were within the state or region. So some of them did answer through a particular survey, but were outside of our particular study region. So we can include them in national analyses, but they won't be included in these state level preliminary results. In both cases, 85% or more of the businesses surveyed were currently open. Some of them had remained open the entire time. Some were closed temporarily, but have now reopened. And then roughly 10 to 15% of the businesses are closed. But the one thing that I want to point out here with these preliminary results is that we are seeing a big difference in what was experienced in California and what was experienced in the Minnesota, Wisconsin region. So you can see in the next several slides that focus on different food supply chain components. California was hit particularly hard. And the question will be, as we dig through the rest of the survey results, was this driven by, what they were growing, the type of business characteristics that are in California or Minnesota, Wisconsin, or in some ways influenced by, what we might call the harshness of the lockdown or the measures that were implemented at the state levels. So looking at production agriculture, we asked them, what type of losses were they experiencing in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and in almost all of these, you'll see that big dip in Q2 when most things were shutting down. And again, in that March to mid-May period that we were surveying initially here, and then start to recover in Q3, Q4, but not necessarily to the point that they are back to normal. But here in the case of Minnesota, Wisconsin, on average, we didn't even see much impact until Q3, and they're reporting a positive impact. When we look at processing and manufacturing, very similar story. There was a big dip in Q2 in California, down 71%, but it starts to come back in Q3, Q4, and similar to production, the processing and manufacturing in Minnesota, Wisconsin, some operations are reporting those losses, but on average, they weren't really impacted in Q1, Q2, and then showed a positive impact in the second half of the year. We also have grocery wholesaling, very similar, big negative results for the entire year for the state of California. But here we see for the first time, Minnesota and Wisconsin reporting that similar shape. So that drop in Q2 with a small recovery in Q3, Q4. Food and beverage retailing. So these are the grocery stores or other retail food outlets. Same story in California, big drop Q2, a small recovery Q3, Q4. But Minnesota, Wisconsin does still experience that drop, just not as significantly. And finally, restaurants. And this was one of those things that, the indoor dining was shut down pretty much nationwide, at least at some point or for some period during the year. So we do see very similar impacts across the two regions. in terms of restaurants. So that big drop in Q2, and then as restaurants were able to reopen, or as they were figuring out how else to serve their customers, a small recovery, but not, still not getting back to the point where they were prior to the pandemic. We also see initially some differences in how the businesses were adapting to the pandemic. So we asked about public health measures that they were adopting as a result of trying to remain open. The businesses in California were reporting a higher incidence of things like conducting daily health checks or requiring face coverings for employees, installing social distance barriers and dividers between employees, or between the employees and the customers. We also asked about other types of business adaptations. So were they changing their hours of operations or experiencing changes in employment like layoffs or furloughs? We saw a higher incidence in California of changing hours of operations and in these layoffs and furloughs, but a higher incidence of hiring new people in Minnesota, Wisconsin. And that makes sense from some of those results that we were showing in the production and processing industries in the previous few slides. Finally, in terms of things like sourcing input products or goods and services from different suppliers. So it seems like initially Minnesota and Wisconsin had a higher incidence of operations that decided to source from different suppliers than they would normally use, and also increasing the number of suppliers. Selling through different sales channels or increasing the number of sales channels. It seems like they were more flexible or more adaptive. The question is going to be, why did we see that? Is it due to these changes in the business or differences in business characteristics? Is it due to differences in regulations that might make that easier, or just the differences in the markets that they are buying from and selling into? Just to give you an idea of where we are at in this particular project, it's a 2-year project. The red line represents sort of where we are at now. And this COVID-19 impact survey is really only that first row up at the top. There's several other things that we have left to do to try to, look at where might some of these regional supply chains already be in place, where are they possible, where are they not possible, to determine some of those answers to the broader objectives that I shared at the very beginning. Okay, so then finally, the final piece is, I am used to working with data constantly. Many of you as researchers are probably used to working with data constantly. And since I'm looking at data on people, and people are just more interesting than their numbers sometimes, we had this feeling that we should be collecting more information about the stories and the experiences behind the data rather than just the data themselves, especially when we see such a wide variation in reported changes or experiences during the event across these surveys. So we actually, this effort started in Southwest Florida with David Outerbridge, who's the county extension director, I believe, for Lee County. And he came to me with this idea. He had spoken with some colleagues there at Florida Gulf Coast University, and we just decided to start documenting stories and capturing data. So we've been, we did have IRB approval to do this. We are doing it unfunded, but we're collecting interviews via Zoom with several agents helping us in that data collection process, and asking businesses, what was your experience? What type of adaptations did you have, or innovations? Were there regulations that inhibited or enabled or enlightened you to change how your business was operating? And then just a little bit about risk perception. So whether they felt prepared to weather something like the pandemic before the pandemic, or whether they feel like they're more prepared now if they've made some adaptations there. Just some very general things that we and others have learned so far as everybody kind of hopped on to try to assess this. is that what seems to have worked is operations that had strong relationships with key suppliers tended to do better. Operations that had agile production and distribution so that they could maintain supply. So as we saw the Minnesota and Wisconsin sort of changing up or being more flexible about where they were getting their input goods and services from. And just supply chain planning. So folks that had thought about the supply chain and thought about some of these risks that were inherent in their purchasing patterns tended to do better. What seems to have limited effective response or limited the ability to weather the pandemic is this: if you had a single geography for your market or your supply, and that geography was cut off, then that was a really significant problem for a particular business. Single suppliers for key products: if you had a single supplier, they went short or weren't able to serve you and you couldn't switch or didn't want to switch, then that was obviously a problem. Lacking the visibility required to see risks. If this is something that had never crossed your mind and you were not prepared to deal with it, that obviously makes it harder. And then improper inventory systems or just operations being what we would term too rigid generally seem to be a problem. What we're hoping for moving beyond the pandemic is that a lot of the information that we're collecting can help operations make adjustments, make improvements, innovate so that they're more resilient in the future, be more flexible when it's necessary. Transparency, so the ability for us to collect this information and analyze it and get some of these generalizations out is really good. And we will be doing that through education as much as we can. I'll just remind you of the complexity of the food system here at the very end. So, we've talked about this operational subsystem or the value chain from input supply all the way to consumption here. But we do have to remember that they're operating within these other systems. So they're operating within an information and service subsystem, where research and extension can provide some things. There's a financial system that might enable or inhibit some of the flexibility that we're talking about. Logistics obviously comes through in the supply chain. And then a political subsystem, right? So there's local, state, federal regulations, laws, rules that they have to operate within that may themselves have enabled or inhibited change. This is a slide I normally use just for policy implications of our disaster impact analysis work generally. I am of the opinion that national strategies for disaster risk reduction that support resilience and sustainable agriculture development have to do a lot of several things. We need to design resilience measures that are specific to different crop, livestock, fisheries, and forestry subsectors. So a lot of what works for every other industry doesn't necessarily work for agriculture. We have things like crop insurance. We've had several COVID-19 related relief efforts. All of these are important risk management tools, but they're often insufficient for the types of losses that are experienced. Meaning that either the individual needed to have some risk management tools on their own beyond these, or they were just experiencing these significant losses. And reviewing the existing policies and recovery tools to decrease or prevent the need for one-time special allocations is ideal. Obviously, they're needed sometimes when there's a huge event, but providing greater certainty by reducing the amount of time it takes to allocate these emergency funds is necessary. They moved pretty quickly during COVID-19, but in the past, after a hurricane or another type of natural disaster event, sometimes a grower is waiting 18 months on a payment for a particular disaster relief fund. And a grower might not be able to weather 18 months and stay in business before they get that check. And just adopting strategies that counteract potential compounding impacts of disaster. So we've had here in the state, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael, several other events. So it's not just, responding to a single event, but sometimes we're hit year after year by events which inhibits growth in the sector over time. And our opinion is that effective policy is going to require timely and commodity specific damage and loss data, and that's what our group is trying to provide. I get asked all the time by industry, so I'll preempt it here with you guys as well. Why don't we have answers yet? As economic modelers, shouldn't we have models that are ready to go, and we can just say, input some numbers on the initial impact and know what's going to happen? But I like to come back to this idea of known knowns and all the way to unknown unknowns. What do we know? I mean, we know that there were non-essential business closures. We know now, or have a pretty good idea of what those direct impacts to different sectors were in 2020. And we know that there was some COVID-19 relief by the federal government and in some local areas. What we don't yet know or have a good idea on is what are these broader economic impacts of these things, or what we might normally term multiplier effects. So these are difficult for disaster impacts for agriculture to begin with, but especially if we're operating on data and models that are based on historical data. All of a sudden we have a pandemic that makes the economy look totally different. They're not necessarily compatible for us to be very sure of our results when we're using them here. Unknown knowns, we still have no idea what else policymakers might be doing in 2021 to combat some of this. And then we still don't know what the rest of 2021 will bring. So 2020 was an eventful year for all of us, and we're hoping that 2021 is better, but we really just don't know yet. So teasing out some of the uncertainty there is really difficult to do. So finish with a quote. Mathematician George Box says, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. Your model has to be wrong, but the important point is that's okay if it's illuminating. So what we're trying to do here is provide data and insights for informed decision making, even if they're not exactly right when we get a year, 5 years down the future. That's all. I've got a list of ways to engage here. If you have networks that you would like to share some of this information with, I'll note that our website is being redesigned right now, and so it's in a state of flux, but you can also get project specific information in other places. Thanks.
Thank you a lot, Christa. That was very informative. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Yeah, let's give you, we can give you a virtual applause. Very.
I'll just pretend I'm hearing thunderous applause.
Yes.
That's what I always do.
and clearly a lot of work went into making these models and so on, and a lot to come. So it's very interesting. I see it updated a lot from the last time I heard you talk, the policy conference at the county level. It's really interesting. Well, to start off, like one thing I was thinking is, of course, when you're comparing Minnesota and Wisconsin to California, we're talking about very different crops, right? So Minnesota and Wisconsin is very much commodity crops. And in California would be more fruits and vegetables and nuts and so on. And also when I was looking at the Florida data, when we looked at the counties that were hit really hard, like here in Miami-Dade County, another big thing is would be probably more similar to California, right? On some of these higher end, higher value crops that probably because they're fresh produce cannot be stored and sold later. Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's probably one of the big factors in the differences that you might find in this.
I think that's definitely true on the production side. So they are specialty crop state, much like we were, and in season when things started to shut down. I do know that California had more access to processing than we did for certain crops. So something like strawberries, if they weren't sold or are typically sold into the fresh market here in Florida, that shut down, they weren't able to sell into hospitality and food service. They just didn't get sold, or they were perhaps donated in small quantities. In California, they had access to turn them into jam right? So in a lot of cases, there was a crop that's typically sold fresh. If you had access to processing, you could recover some of that by turning it into something more shelf stable. And we just don't have that here in the state of Florida. So I think that's one thing that we'll be looking into is, whether or not it doesn't exist here because it's completely uneconomical in times, when times are not disaster times, or would it be good to have something like that in case we are in disaster times more often in the future. But yeah, we did ask in the survey what commodity group they were within, even within that production agriculture, so we'll be able to tease some of that out.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be really interesting. And what are some of the counties that you're going to have enough data to go into in Florida?
So the first one that we're trying is Polk. You saw Polk there at 50 plus responses. And I think we have good baseline data for the two big commodities there, which were the cattle and citrus. So I think we can do some location and commodity specific results there in Polk County. And, ideally, having some of that available makes another county say, I wish I had those numbers for myself. And I can say, well, you didn't answer the survey, maybe next time. But yeah, we're working with the folks in the county extension office there in Polk first, and then we'll see what we can do otherwise. Even if we can't do a county specific report for every county, we can do a regional. In most cases, we had a multi-county region where we had enough responses where we could have region-specific estimates on losses, even if the counties themselves individually did not have enough. And in some cases, if we need to use the state level average, we can keep to that as well.
Was there anything that surprised you when you looked at the results?
I don't think anything's, it just the sheer downward drop, it surprised me that, we're seeing a 90% loss or 80% loss in some cases, which for a multi-month period is a big hit for an operation. It surprised me in the new results that are coming out that, Minnesota and Wisconsin were not hit nearly as hard as some of these other states. So I think we're going to find more and more things as we can compare geographies that are, more surprising than some of our initial efforts. But everything was very, very negative at the beginning of the pandemic, with everything shutting down and nobody knowing what was going on. So the size surprised me, but not that something was happening. But now finding out that, those impacts were very different in different places, I think is going to be very interesting to dig into.
Christa, I have a question.
Sure.
Actually, I have two questions and maybe a comment. I was wondering if if in your survey you included questions about like the number of workers at for the different farms, or who were affected by COVID, like physically infected by COVID.
Yeah, so we did ask a couple of questions about employment. We asked, whether they had let any number of workers go, or if they were having trouble with workers calling in sick, or maybe quitting, or having to take care of a family member. We asked more of those questions in the new survey than we did in the old survey. And we do have information on just general employment, both domestic labor and the H-2A certifications, that we can start to, kind of allocate job year losses, not just these sales revenue losses. So in some cases, we'll be able to do that as well.
And then I thought it was really interesting, the spread and how some industries were 100% impacted, but also 100% okay. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense for why some of those, some companies did really well and some didn't?
So I think most of, when we started to dig into it here in Florida, initially, most of it came down to their traditional customer base and whether they were able to switch that to serve an at-home food consumption audience, right? So I know initially when things were shutting down, when the meat warehouses were having, infections going through them or shutting down, where some of the meat shelves were empty at the grocery store, you could still, I was still purchasing meat from a local farm here in Florida, which I hadn't done prior to the pandemic. So I know a lot of them increased things like their online sales, or were having pop-up shops. But not every operation was able to do that, right? So I think it's going to come down to different business characteristics, whether or not they lost their typical market, and if they lost their typical market, could they switch up and serve the new market instead of just waiting idle for that market to come back?
I know that I went and got some clams from some local purveyors. So
Yep. I now have there's a aquaculture operation from the Gulf Coast that comes and delivers into Gainesville once every week or 2 weeks, depending on the time of year. And we started buying from them during the pandemic too.
great. As you were answering that last question, it made me think of how the sales of like Blue Apron and those home delivery kits increased.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it's probably beyond your scope of your survey, but I'm wondering if you know if Florida growers participate in that.
Yeah, so it is beyond the scope of this particular survey, but we have a consumer survey as the second component, or it's about to be released from the lessons from COVID-19 project. And I think that one of the things they're going to ask is whether people increased their consumption of purchases at these at-home boxes, whether they were using the online grocery shopping instead of going into the store, things like that. So we might see some of that, but I don't know how many growers are growing for those markets here in Florida. And I don't know if any of them are marketed as a fresh from Florida box. I know most of them like to market themselves as local food, food from within however many miles to where your box was packed before it comes to you. But I don't have the data to answer the question.
Yeah.
But it is interesting.
Yeah. Anyone else have any questions from Zoom land?
Is that consumer, just to piggyback on the probably more questions, is that consumer survey going to look throughout? Because I'm really curious. I think we're really curious to see what will the trends be. But once, like, you're buying your oysters locally, right? What will you keep buying those oysters? Will people just switch their purchasing habits?
Yeah, I think they're hoping to find, they're hoping to answer some of those questions. I'm trying to stay in my lane and not, I'm not privy to every meeting that they've had so far, but the big group meetings where we hear the updates, those are some of the things that they're going to be trying to figure out is, as things are opening back up now, how much did you change initially? And then as things are opening back up, what behaviors are you keeping versus which ones are you going back to what you did before the pandemic?
So any other questions? I think we have several grad students still on.
So I'll ask a question of people, or just let you know about one other thing that's going on. One of the things that we're doing to sort of improve our process of disaster impact analysis generally is collect any information that anybody has on past disasters. And I know that I've seen several faculty members at different RACs report or publish what happened to their